You pause outside the throne room, and through a crack in the heavy oak doors, you catch a glimpse of him, Ferdinand VII of Spain. He sits slouched on his golden throne, a cruel smile playing across his lips as he signs yet another death warrant. His eyes hold a particular gleam as he condemns another traitor, someone whose only crime was believing that the people deserved a voice in their own governance. This man, this king who would become known as the felon king, didn't pervert his kingdom through scandalous personal behavior. No, Ferdinand VII's perversion was far more insidious, far more destructive. He perverted the very concept of kingship itself, transforming it from a duty to serve into a license to torture, oppress, and systematically destroy anyone who dared imagine a better Spain. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering under one of history's most tyrannical monarchs, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the depths of Ferdinand VII's cruelty, we must first grasp the world that shaped him, a world where absolute monarchy was not just a political system, but a divine right granted by God himself. Born in 1784, Ferdinand came of age during one of the most turbulent periods in European history, watching his father Charles IV bumble through crisis after crisis, while his mother, Maria Luisa, wielded power from the shadows alongside her alleged lover, Manuel Godoy. The Spanish court of Ferdinand's youth was a cesspool of intrigue, corruption, and moral decay. Here, young Ferdinand learned that power was not about service. It was about survival. He watched as his parents' weakness invited French invasion, as Napoleon's armies marched across Spanish soil, as the very foundations of the ancient Spanish Empire crumbled beneath the weight of incompetence and foreign interference. But it was during his captivity in France, from 1808 to 1814, that Ferdinand's twisted understanding of kingship truly crystallized. For 6 long years, he was essentially Napoleon's prisoner, forced to watch helplessly as Spain convulsed in the Peninsular War. During this time, something remarkable happened in his absence. The Spanish people, united in their hatred of foreign occupation, created something unprecedented. A liberal constitution, the Constitution of 1812, forged in the crucible of war and resistance, represented everything Ferdinand would come to despise. It limited royal power, established basic civil rights, and dared to suggest that sovereignty belonged not to the king alone, but to the nation. For Ferdinand, imprisoned and impotent, this constitution wasn't liberation, it was theft. It was the people stealing what God had given to him and him alone. When Ferdinand finally returned to Spanish soil in 1814, he didn't see subjects celebrating the king's return. He saw traitors who had dared to govern themselves in his absence. And he would spend the next 19 years making them pay for their audacity. Let us examine the human cost of Ferdinand's twisted worldview through the story of Diego Muñoz Torrero, one of the principal architects of the 1812 Constitution. Picture Muñoz Torrero on March 24th, 1814, a man who had spent 6 years fighting to create a better Spain. now watching in horror as Ferdinand VII officially abolished the constitution with a single stroke of his pen. Muñoz Torero was not a radical revolutionary. He was a priest, a scholar, a man who believed deeply that Spain could embrace both monarchy and liberty. He had worked tirelessly during the war to maintain Spanish independence while building a framework for progressive governance. His crime? Believing that kings should be accountable to their people. Within weeks of Ferdinand's return, Muñoz Torero found himself imprisoned in the fortress of San Anton in La Coruña. The conditions were deliberately horrific, designed not just to punish, but to break. The cells were damp, crawling with vermin, and deliberately overcrowded. Political prisoners were forced to share space with common criminals, subjected to deliberate humiliation and abuse. But the psychological torture was worse than the physical degradation. Ferdinand's agents made sure that prisoners knew their families were being watched, their children marked as the offspring of traitors. Muñoz Torero spent years not knowing if his loved ones were safe, not knowing if his scholarly work would survive, not knowing if Spain would ever again see the light of constitutional governance. The paranoia this created was exactly what Ferdinand intended. By 1820, when a military uprising finally forced him to restore the constitution temporarily, Muñoz Torero was a broken man. The brilliant scholar who had once crafted eloquent arguments for limited monarchy now jumped at shadows, his health shattered by years of imprisonment and psychological abuse. And Muñoz Torero was just one of thousands. Ferdinand's purge of 1814 swept up anyone who had supported constitutional government during his absence. Judges, military officers, intellectuals, merchants. Anyone who had dared imagine that Spain could be governed by law rather than royal whim found themselves facing imprisonment, exile, or worse. Perhaps no single story better illustrates Ferdinand's perverse understanding of power than his treatment of Rafael del Riego, the military officer who led the liberal uprising of 1820. Riego's story is one of extraordinary courage meeting systematic destruction. A man who briefly restored constitutional government to Spain, only to face Ferdinand's ultimate revenge. In January 1820, Riego was a lieutenant colonel stationed in Andalusia, watching in disgust as Ferdinand prepared to send Spanish troops to crush independence movements in South America. These were Spain's own colonies, fighting for the same principles of self-governance that Spain itself had embraced during the war against Napoleon. The hypocrisy was staggering. Ferdinand was prepared to spill Spanish blood to deny others the very freedoms that had once defined Spanish resistance. Riego couldn't stomach it. On January 1st, 1820, he stood before his troops and declared his support for the Constitution of 1812. His words echoed across Spain like thunder. Soldiers, the homeland calls you to defend its sacred rights. Swear to the political constitution of the Spanish monarchy. The response was electric. Within months, the entire country had rallied to Riego's cause. Ferdinand, faced with nationwide revolt, was forced to swear allegiance to the very constitution he had spent 6 years trying to destroy. For 3 brief years, the so-called liberal triennium Spain experienced genuine constitutional monarchy. But Ferdinand never forgot. He spent those 3 years plotting his revenge, secretly corresponding with foreign powers, begging them to intervene and restore his absolute authority. In 1823, French forces, the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, invaded Spain at Ferdinand's invitation, crushing the constitutional government and restoring royal absolutism. Riego's capture was Ferdinand's personal triumph. The king could have simply executed the man who had humiliated him, but that would have been too quick, too merciful. Instead, Ferdinand orchestrated a deliberate spectacle of degradation designed to break not just Riego, but the spirit of Spanish liberalism itself. Riego was dragged through the streets of Madrid on a hurdle, a wooden frame typically used for common criminals. The crowds who had once cheered his name were forced to watch as their hero was reduced to a figure of mockery and shame. But even then, even facing certain death, Riego maintained his dignity. Witnesses reported that he faced his executioners with calm resolve, his final words a testament to his unshakable belief in constitutional government. Ferdinand had Riego hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment typically reserved for traitors against the crown. But the king's sadism didn't end with Riego's death. Ferdinand ordered that Riego's severed head be placed on public display and that his property be confiscated, leaving his family destitute. It was a message written in blood. This is what happens to those who dare challenge absolute royal authority. What drove Ferdinand VII to such systematic cruelty? To understand his twisted psychology, we must recognize that his was not the casual brutality of a simple tyrant, but the calculated sadism of a man consumed by paranoia and a pathological need for control. Ferdinand's fundamental worldview was shaped by a deep-seated belief that any limitation on royal power was not just political opposition, but personal betrayal. He couldn't distinguish between criticism of his policies and attacks on his person. In his mind, the Constitution of 1812 wasn't a framework for governance. It was a personal humiliation, a public declaration that he was unworthy of absolute trust. This paranoia manifested in several disturbing ways. Ferdinand developed an extensive network of spies and informants who reported not just on political activities, but on private conversations, personal relationships, even casual comments made in taverns or coffee houses. No Spanish citizen could feel safe from surveillance. The king's agents were everywhere. Servants in great houses, priests in confessionals, teachers in universities. The psychological impact on Spanish society was devastating. People learned to censor not just their public statements, but their private thoughts. Parents stopped discussing politics with their children, fearing that innocent comments might be misinterpreted and reported. Teachers abandoned any curriculum that might encourage critical thinking. The entire intellectual life of the nation withered under the weight of Ferdinand's paranoid suspicions. But perhaps most disturbing was Ferdinand's apparent enjoyment of his victims' suffering. Contemporary accounts describe the king taking personal interest in the details of prisoners' conditions, sometimes ordering specific humiliations or punishments. He would read reports of interrogations with evident pleasure and was known to keep detailed files on perceived enemies, complete with notes about their families, their weaknesses, their fears. This wasn't just political repression. It was psychological warfare waged by a king against his own people. Ferdinand understood instinctively that the most effective way to destroy opposition wasn't simply to imprison or execute opponents, but to terrorize them into hopelessness, to make resistance seem not just dangerous, but futile. The trauma this created rippled through Spanish society for generations. Families learned to distrust each other. Friendships withered under the weight of suspicion. The very social bonds that hold a nation together began to fray as Ferdinand's reign of terror convinced people that their neighbors, their colleagues, even their loved ones might be reporting their words to the royal authorities. Ferdinand's perversion of power extended beyond political opponents to the very institutions that might nurture critical thinking or intellectual independence. His systematic destruction of Spanish universities reveals a mind that understood with chilling clarity that knowledge itself was a threat to absolute monarchy. Consider the story of the University of Salamanca, once one of Europe's most prestigious centers of learning. Founded in 1218, Salamanca had produced some of the greatest minds in Spanish history. Theologians, philosophers, legal scholars who had shaped not just Spanish thought, but European intellectual development for centuries. Under Ferdinand's rule, Salamanca became a shadow of its former self. The king's educational policies, implemented through his Minister of Justice, were designed not to improve learning, but to control it. Professors suspected of liberal sympathies were dismissed without trial or explanation. Entire fields of study, particularly law, philosophy, and anything that might encourage questioning of authority, were either heavily censored or eliminated entirely. Professor Antonio Garcia Herreros, who had taught constitutional law during the liberal triennium, exemplifies the human cost of Ferdinand's intellectual persecution. Garcia Herreros was not a revolutionary. He was a scholar who believed that understanding law required examining different systems of governance. His lectures during the constitutional period had been models of academic objectivity, presenting various theoretical frameworks without advocating for any particular political system. But to Ferdinand, academic objectivity was itself a form of treason. How dare a professor present constitutional monarchy as a legitimate subject of study? How dare he suggest that there might be multiple valid approaches to governance? Garcia Herreros was not just dismissed, he was imprisoned, his personal library confiscated and burned, his family harassed and impoverished. The burning of Garcia Herreros' library was particularly symbolic of Ferdinand's approach to intellectual life. These weren't just books. They were centuries of accumulated human knowledge, irreplaceable manuscripts, works of scholarship that had taken decades to collect. Ferdinand's agents made a public spectacle of the burning, forcing other professors to watch as flames consumed not just Garcia Herreros' life work, but the very idea that knowledge could exist independent of royal approval. The impact on Spanish intellectual life was catastrophic. Students learned to avoid any subject that might be deemed politically sensitive. Professors taught only the most basic, uncontroversial material. The spirit of inquiry that had once made Spanish universities centers of European learning was systematically strangled. But the psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the intellectual destruction. Young Spaniards learned that curiosity itself was dangerous, that asking questions could destroy not just their own futures, but their families' safety. An entire generation grew up believing that it was safer to remain ignorant than to risk the consequences of knowledge. To fully understand Ferdinand's systematic cruelty, we must examine the specific mechanisms he used to maintain control. His was not the crude brutality of a simple despot, but a sophisticated system of oppression that anticipated many of the techniques later perfected by modern totalitarian regimes. Ferdinand's Spain relied on what we might call participatory paranoia, a system where ordinary citizens were encouraged through both rewards and threats to spy on their neighbors. The king established a formal network of informants, but also created an atmosphere where casual denunciation became a form of self-protection. If you reported suspicious behavior, you were less likely to be reported yourself. This system was psychologically brilliant in its cruelty. It didn't just identify and punish opposition. It prevented opposition from forming in the first place. People couldn't trust each other enough to organize resistance. Every potential ally might be an informant. Every private conversation might be reported. The mere possibility of surveillance was often more effective than actual surveillance. Ferdinand also understood the power of unpredictable punishment. If repression had been systematic and predictable, people might have found ways to avoid it. But Ferdinand's justice was deliberately arbitrary. Loyal supporters might suddenly find themselves under suspicion. People who had never expressed a political opinion might be imprisoned based on anonymous accusations. This randomness created a climate of helplessness where no one felt safe, regardless of their behavior. The king's use of spectacle was equally calculated. Public executions, like Riegos, weren't just punishments. They were theatrical performances designed to break the spirit of potential opposition. Ferdinand understood that making an example of prominent resistors would have a multiplier effect, terrorizing hundreds of potential opponents for every actual victim. Perhaps most insidiously, Ferdinand perfected what we might call bureaucratic cruelty, the use of official procedures to inflict maximum psychological damage. Prisoners weren't simply executed or imprisoned. They were processed through elaborate legal proceedings designed to create false hope, followed by crushing despair. Families weren't simply informed of their loved ones' fates. They were kept in agonizing uncertainty for months or years. Ferdinand's restoration of the Spanish Inquisition in 1814 represents perhaps the most perverse aspect of his reign. The deliberate revival of an institution that even his own predecessors had recognized as an anachronism. By the early 19th century, most of Europe had moved beyond religious persecution as a tool of statecraft. But Ferdinand saw in the Inquisition not just a weapon against religious dissent, but a perfect instrument for political repression. The case of Cayetano Ripoll illustrates the horrific intersection of religious and political persecution under Ferdinand's restored Inquisition. Ripoll was a school teacher in Valencia, a man whose crime was not heresy in any traditional sense, but rather his association with liberal ideas during the French occupation and the constitutional period. Ripoll had been educated in France and had adopted some modern pedagogical methods that emphasized rational thinking over rote memorization. During the constitutional period, he had taught his students to think critically about the world around them. He had dared to suggest that education should prepare young people to be informed citizens rather than merely obedient subjects. To Ferdinand's inquisitors, this was a heresy of the worst kind. Ripoll was arrested in 1824 on charges of heretical propositions, a deliberately vague accusation that could be applied to almost any independent thought. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of psychological torture disguised as legal procedure. For 2 years, Ripoll was held in the Inquisition's prisons while his case was investigated. The conditions were deliberately designed to break down his mental and physical health. He was kept in solitary confinement, denied adequate food and medical care, and subjected to irregular interrogations designed to create constant anxiety about his fate. But the cruelest aspect of Ripoll's persecution was the false hope repeatedly dangled before him. Inquisition officials would suggest that confession and repentance might lead to clemency, only to add new charges when he complied. They would hint that influential friends were working for his release, then produce evidence that these same friends had betrayed him. The psychological manipulation was relentless and sophisticated. The final verdict, delivered in 1826, condemned Ripoll to death for pertinacious heresy. But even his execution was designed as an instrument of terror. Rather than a simple execution, the Inquisition staged an elaborate auto de fe, a public ceremony of humiliation and death that hadn't been seen in Spain for decades. Ripoll was forced to wear the San Benito the peaked cap and yellow robe that marked condemned heretics and was paraded through the streets of Valencia while crowds jeered and threw stones. The procession was deliberately slow, designed to maximize both Ripoll's humiliation and the crowd's exposure to the spectacle of what happened to those who challenged authority. At the execution site, Ripoll was given one final opportunity to confess and receive the mercy of strangulation before burning. Contemporary accounts describe his dignified refusal and his calm demeanor as the flames consumed him. But Ferdinand had achieved his goal. Cayetano Ripoll became the last person executed by the Spanish Inquisition, a final, horrific symbol of absolute monarchy's war against human progress. The psychological impact of Ripoll's execution extended far beyond Valencia. Teachers throughout Spain learned that independent thought was literally a matter of life and death. Parents removed their children from schools suspected of progressive methods. The entire Spanish educational system retreated into medieval obscurantism, setting back Spanish intellectual development by generations. Ferdinand's cruelty extended beyond male political opponents to encompass a systematic persecution of women who dared challenge traditional gender roles or support liberal causes. The story of Mariana Pineda, executed in 1831 for embroidering a liberal flag, reveals the particular sadism Ferdinand reserved for women who transgressed prescribed boundaries. Mariana Pineda was not a political leader or intellectual theorist. She was a young widow from Granada, whose only crime was her romantic involvement with liberal conspirators and her willingness to embroider a flag bearing the liberal slogan, "Law, Liberty, Equality." In any rational justice system, such actions might have warranted a fine or brief imprisonment. Under Ferdinand's regime, they became capital offenses. Pineda's persecution reveals the gendered nature of Ferdinand's repression. While men were typically portrayed as dangerous political opponents who deserved punishment, Women were characterized as corrupted innocents who had been led astray by masculine influence. This framing allowed Ferdinand's regime to present female persecution as a form of paternal correction rather than political oppression. But the reality was far more sinister. Pineda was subjected to intense psychological pressure designed to break her will and force her to betray her male accomplices. Inquisition officials alternately threatened her children's safety and promised their protection in exchange for cooperation. They exploited her maternal instincts in ways that were deliberately calculated to cause maximum emotional distress. When these tactics failed, Pineda faced a trial that was essentially a foregone conclusion. The evidence against her was minimal, essentially consisting of the embroidered flag and testimony from informants seeking reduced sentences for their own crimes. But Ferdinand's courts weren't interested in evidence. They were interested in making examples. Pineda's execution was particularly cruel because it was designed to send a specific message to Spanish women. Step outside your prescribed role and you will face the ultimate penalty. The young widow was publicly garroted in Granada's main square while crowds watched in horrified silence. Her death was meant to terrorize not just political opponents, but any woman who might dare to express independent opinions or support progressive causes. The broader impact of cases like Pineda's was the creation of a climate where Spanish women learned that political engagement of any kind was mortally dangerous. This had profound consequences for Spanish society, as women's voices were systematically silenced, just as Europe was beginning to grapple with questions of gender equality and women's rights. Ferdinand's repression wasn't occurring in a vacuum. It was happening at precisely the moment when liberal movements were gaining strength throughout Europe. The contrast between Ferdinand's Spain and the progressive developments in other European nations reveals just how deliberately reactionary his policies were. By the 1820s, most European monarchs had recognized that some accommodation with liberal principles was both inevitable and beneficial. Even conservative rulers understood that absolute monarchy was becoming politically and economically unsustainable. Constitutional monarchies were emerging across Europe, offering models for how traditional authority could coexist with popular participation in governance. But Ferdinand rejected these examples entirely. He saw constitutional monarchy not as evolution, but as surrender, a betrayal of the divine right that he believed made him God's representative on earth. His correspondence with other European rulers reveals a man increasingly isolated in his absolutist convictions, unable to understand why his fellow monarchs were betraying their sacred obligations by accepting limitations on their power. This international isolation had profound consequences for Spain itself. While other European nations were modernizing their economies, developing their educational systems, and gradually expanding political participation, Spain under Ferdinand was moving backward. The country that had once been Europe's greatest power was systematically cutting itself off from the intellectual, economic, and political developments that were reshaping the continent. Ferdinand's policies created a vicious cycle of decline. Political repression discouraged entrepreneurship and innovation. Educational restrictions prevented the development of human capital necessary for economic modernization. International isolation limited trade and cultural exchange. By the end of Ferdinand's reign, Spain had become what we might recognize today as a failed state, a nation whose institutions had been so thoroughly corrupted that basic governance became impossible. Perhaps the most long-lasting consequence of Ferdinand's perverted understanding of power was his manipulation of the Spanish succession in ways that would plunge the country into civil war for generations. His treatment of his daughter Isabella II's legitimacy reveals a man whose narcissism was so complete that he was willing to destroy his own kingdom rather than allow it to develop beyond his control. Ferdinand's marriage history itself tells a story of dysfunction and manipulation. His 4 marriages were driven not by affection or even political alliance, but by his desperate need to produce a male heir who would continue his absolute monarchy. When his 4th wife, Maria Cristina, gave birth to a daughter in 1830, Ferdinand faced a crisis that revealed the depths of his selfishness. Spanish law traditionally followed Salic succession, which excluded women from inheriting the throne. Ferdinand's brother Carlos was next in line, and Carlos was even more reactionary than Ferdinand himself, a man who viewed even Ferdinand's limited concessions to modernity as dangerous compromises with liberalism. A rational king might have recognized that Carlos's extreme conservatism would destroy Spain entirely. But Ferdinand's decision to change the succession law wasn't motivated by concern for his kingdom's welfare. It was driven by his inability to accept that his bloodline might not continue to rule Spain in exactly the manner he desired. The Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, which allowed Isabella to inherit the throne, was Ferdinand's final act of monarchical perversion. Rather than preparing Spain for orderly transition to more modern governance, he created a succession crisis that would tear the country apart. He knew that changing the succession law would provoke civil war, but he was more concerned with ensuring his daughter's inheritance than with preventing Spanish bloodshed. The human cost of this decision was staggering. The Carlist Wars that followed Ferdinand's death in 1833 would consume Spain for decades, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and further retarding the country's political and economic development. Entire regions were devastated by fighting between supporters of Isabella II and the Carlist pretenders. But perhaps most tragically, Ferdinand's manipulation of the succession ensured that Spain would continue to be ruled by absolute monarchs long after most of Europe had moved toward constitutional government. Isabella II would prove nearly as authoritarian as her father, and the instability created by the succession crisis would contribute to decades of political chaos that prevented Spain from developing stable democratic institutions. Modern psychological analysis can help us understand Ferdinand VII as a textbook example of what we now recognize as narcissistic personality disorder, a condition characterized by grandiose self-image, inability to empathize with others, and pathological need for control and admiration. Ferdinand displayed all the classic symptoms of narcissistic pathology. His sense of entitlement was absolute. He genuinely believed that his desires, no matter how trivial, justified any level of violence or oppression. His inability to distinguish between criticism of his policies and personal attacks revealed a complete fusion of his individual identity with his role as king. Perhaps most tellingly, Ferdinand showed no capacity for genuine empathy with his subjects' suffering. Contemporary accounts describe a man who could order mass executions with the same emotional detachment he might show when ordering dinner. The pain he inflicted wasn't collateral damage in pursuit of political goals. It was simply irrelevant to his psychological calculations. This narcissistic pathology was particularly dangerous because it was combined with absolute power. In other contexts, Ferdinand's personality disorders might have made him merely an unpleasant individual. But as King of Spain, his psychological dysfunction became a national catastrophe that destroyed countless lives and set back Spanish development by generations. Ferdinand's need for constant validation also explains his obsession with ceremonial displays of submission and his rage when faced with any form of independence. He couldn't tolerate the existence of Spanish citizens who didn't actively demonstrate their devotion to his person. The very idea that people might go about their daily lives without constantly acknowledging his authority was psychologically intolerable. This psychological profile helps explain why Ferdinand's repression was so systematic and personal. He wasn't simply trying to maintain political control. He was waging war against any suggestion that Spanish life could exist independently of his will. Every autonomous institution, every independent thought, every expression of human dignity that didn't explicitly acknowledge his supremacy was experienced as a personal attack that demanded violent response. Ferdinand's political repression had devastating economic consequences that reveal another dimension of his regime's perversity. His policies didn't just destroy human lives, they systematically impoverished the Spanish nation and ensured its decline relative to other European powers. The persecution of liberal merchants and entrepreneurs eliminated much of Spain's emerging middle class. These were precisely the people who might have led Spanish economic modernization, who understood international markets and modern business practices. By imprisoning, executing, or forcing into exile the country's most economically dynamic citizens, Ferdinand ensured that Spain would fall further behind its European competitors. Ferdinand's educational policies compounded this economic damage by preventing the development of human capital necessary for industrial development. Countries like Britain and France were beginning to reap the benefits of expanded education and scientific research. But Ferdinand's Spain was moving in the opposite direction, systematically destroying institutions that might have prepared Spanish citizens for economic modernization. The restoration of guild systems and other medieval economic restrictions reflected Ferdinand's belief that economic progress itself was politically dangerous. He understood instinctively that economic development would create new social classes, new sources of wealth and power that might challenge royal authority. Rather than finding ways to harness economic development for national benefit, Ferdinand chose to strangle it entirely. By the end of Ferdinand's reign, Spain had become an economic backwater. The country that had once controlled vast colonial wealth was now dependent on foreign loans and investment. Spanish industry was primitive compared to Northern European development. Agricultural productivity remained medieval in many regions. The Spanish currency was unstable and Spanish credit was poor throughout European financial markets. This economic decline created a vicious cycle that reinforced political repression. As Spain became poorer and weaker, Ferdinand's government became more dependent on force to maintain control. Economic failure bred political instability, which justified increased repression, which further damaged economic development. Ferdinand's systematic destruction of press freedom illustrates how his regime understood the power of information control decades before modern totalitarian governments perfected these techniques. His treatment of Spanish journalists and publishers reveals a mind that grasped intuitively how communication networks could be used to maintain psychological control over entire populations. The story of José Marchena, editor of the liberal newspaper El Español, exemplifies the human cost of Ferdinand's war against free expression. Marchena was not a radical revolutionary. He was a moderate liberal who believed in constitutional monarchy and gradual reform. His newspaper advocated for policies that would be considered mainstream in most contemporary European nations: rule of law, basic civil liberties, economic modernization. But to Ferdinand, Marchena's moderation made him more dangerous, not less. Extreme revolutionaries could be dismissed as fanatics whose ideas were obviously dangerous. But moderate liberals like Marchena presented a much more serious threat. They made progressive ideas seem reasonable and achievable. Ferdinand's persecution of Marchena was characteristically thorough and cruel. Rather than simply shutting down El Español, the king's agents orchestrated a campaign of harassment designed to destroy not just the newspaper, but Marchena personally. Subscribers were intimidated and threatened. Advertisers were pressured to withdraw their support. Distribution networks were systematically disrupted. When these indirect methods proved insufficient, Ferdinand's regime moved to direct persecution. Marchena was arrested on charges of seditious publication, essentially the crime of expressing opinions that the king found disagreeable. His trial was a predetermined spectacle designed to intimidate other journalists and publishers. But the cruelest aspect of Marchena's persecution was its impact on his family. Ferdinand's agents made sure that Marchena's wife and children understood that their welfare depended on his submission. His children were expelled from school and harassed by other students, whose parents feared association with the family of a traitor. His wife faced social ostracism and economic hardship. The psychological pressure was relentless and sophisticated. Marchena was offered reduced punishment in exchange for public renunciation of his liberal opinions. When he refused, the pressure was transferred to his family. His wife was threatened with imprisonment as an accomplice. His children were threatened with permanent exile. The message was clear: your principles are not worth your family's destruction. Eventually, Marchena's spirit was broken. He publicly renounced his liberal opinions and begged Ferdinand's forgiveness. But even this submission wasn't sufficient for the king's sadistic needs. Marchena was released from prison only to find that his reputation was destroyed and his livelihood eliminated. He died in poverty and obscurity, another victim of Ferdinand's systematic war against human dignity. The broader impact of cases like Marchena's was the complete elimination of independent journalism in Spain. Newspapers became mere propaganda organs for the regime. Publishers learned to self-censor to avoid persecution. The free flow of information that was beginning to emerge in other European countries was systematically strangled in Ferdinand's Spain. Ferdinand's domestic repression had profound international consequences that extended far beyond Spain's borders. His request for French intervention in 1823 established precedents for foreign interference in domestic affairs that would plague European politics for decades. The Holy Alliance, the conservative coalition of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, saw Ferdinand's Spain as a test case for their broader campaign against liberal movements throughout Europe. When Ferdinand requested foreign military assistance to crush his own people's constitutional government, he was essentially inviting other European powers to treat Spanish sovereignty as expendable. The French invasion of 1823 was technically successful in restoring Ferdinand's absolute monarchy, but it came at an enormous cost to Spanish national dignity. Spanish soldiers were forced to fight against Spanish citizens on behalf of foreign interests. The very independence that Spain had defended so heroically against Napoleon was now being voluntarily surrendered to serve Ferdinand's personal vendettas. This pattern of dependence on foreign support became characteristic of Ferdinand's later reign. Unable to generate genuine loyalty from his own subjects, he relied increasingly on international conservative networks to maintain his authority. Spanish policy became subordinated to the interests of the Holy Alliance rather than serving Spanish national interests. The South American independence movements provide another example of how Ferdinand's twisted priorities damaged Spanish international standing. Rather than recognizing the inevitable and negotiating favorable terms for Spanish withdrawal from the colonies, Ferdinand wasted enormous resources in futile attempts to restore imperial control. These colonial wars were not just military failures, they were moral disasters that revealed the complete bankruptcy of Ferdinand's worldview. Spanish soldiers were dying in distant lands to deny other peoples the same rights that Spaniards themselves had claimed during the war against Napoleon. The hypocrisy was obvious to everyone except Ferdinand himself. By the end of his reign, Spain had become an international pariah, a nation whose government was seen as illegitimate by progressive opinion throughout Europe, and whose policies were regarded as anachronistic even by conservative allies. Ferdinand had transformed Spain from a great power into a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute monarchy. Ferdinand's perversion of Spanish legal institutions represents perhaps the most fundamental aspect of his destructive reign. By turning courts into instruments of personal vengeance rather than impartial arbiters of law, he destroyed the very foundation of civilized governance. Spanish legal tradition had deep roots in Roman law and medieval jurisprudence that emphasized procedural fairness and proportional punishment. Even under absolute monarchy, Spanish courts had maintained some degree of independence and adherence to established legal principles. But Ferdinand systematically corrupted these institutions to serve his personal and political interests. The transformation of Spanish courts under Ferdinand can be seen in the career of Judge Manuel López Cepero, who had served with distinction under previous monarchs. López Cepero was known for his careful attention to legal precedent and his insistence on proper procedure even in politically sensitive cases. Under Ferdinand's regime, López Cepero faced an impossible choice: abandon his professional integrity or face persecution as an enemy of royal authority. When he attempted to maintain traditional legal standards in cases involving political prisoners, He was removed from office and subjected to investigation by Ferdinand's agents. The message to other judges was unmistakable. Your primary loyalty is not to law or justice, but to the king's personal desires. Verdicts were expected to reflect royal policy rather than legal analysis. Sentences were determined by political considerations rather than proportional punishment. This corruption of justice had devastating psychological effects throughout Spanish society. Citizens learned that legal protection depended not on their actions, but on their political opinions. The very concept of rights became meaningless when courts could not be trusted to enforce them impartially. The long-term consequences extended far beyond Ferdinand's reign. Spanish legal institutions never fully recovered from the corruption he introduced. Decades after his death, Spanish courts continued to be seen as politically compromised and unreliable. This institutional damage made it much more difficult for Spain to develop stable democratic governance in later periods. As we reach the end of this dark journey through Ferdinand VII's reign of terror, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The techniques Ferdinand used to maintain controlled surveillance, arbitrary punishment, corruption of institutions, manipulation of information, have not disappeared from human history. They have simply been refined and modernized by subsequent authoritarian regimes. Ferdinand's Spain serves as a cautionary tale about how quickly civilized institutions can be corrupted when power becomes concentrated in the hands of individuals who view governance as personal property rather than public trust. His systematic destruction of Spanish civil society anticipated many of the methods later perfected by 20th century totalitarian movements. The psychological warfare Ferdinand waged against his own people, the use of fear, paranoia, and isolation to prevent opposition from forming, reveals techniques that remain disturbingly relevant in our contemporary world. Wherever we see governments attacking independent institutions, suppressing free expression, or treating dissent as treason, we can recognize the shadow of Ferdinand VII's legacy. But perhaps the most important lesson from Ferdinand's reign is how individual choices by ordinary citizens can either enable or resist authoritarian control. The Spanish people who served as informants, who remained silent when their neighbors were arrested, who chose personal safety over moral courage. These individuals were not evil, but their collective passivity enabled Ferdinand's systematic cruelty. Conversely, the Spanish citizens who maintained their dignity under persecution, who refused to betray their principles even under extreme pressure, who continued to believe in human rights and constitutional government despite facing imprisonment or death. These individuals kept alive the possibility of eventual liberation. The fundamental question Ferdinand VII's reign poses remains relevant today. What are we willing to sacrifice to maintain our personal safety and comfort? How much injustice are we prepared to tolerate if it doesn't directly affect us? At what point does our silence become complicity in oppression? These are not abstract historical questions. They are moral choices that every generation must face anew. Ferdinand VII's Spain reminds us that civilized governance is fragile, that rights and freedoms we take for granted can disappear with frightening speed when citizens abdicate their responsibility to defend them. The Spanish people who suffered under Ferdinand's rule were not fundamentally different from us. They had families to protect, careers to maintain, personal dreams and ambitions that made political resistance seem dangerous and impractical. But their individual choices, repeated thousands of times across Spanish society, created the conditions that enabled Ferdinand's reign of terror. We must remember them not just as victims of royal oppression, but as human beings who faced impossible choices and whose responses, both courageous and cowardly, shaped their nation's destiny. Their stories remind us that history is not an abstract force, but the accumulated result of individual moral decisions made by ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances. Ferdinand VII died in 1833, but his legacy of fear, corruption, and institutional destruction outlived him by decades. Spain would not achieve stable democratic governance until well into the 20th century, and even then, the country would face repeated authoritarian reversals that can be traced back to the institutional damage inflicted during Ferdinand's reign. Yet Spanish history also provides examples of resilience and recovery that offer hope for contemporary struggles against authoritarianism. The liberal intellectuals who maintained their principles despite persecution, the ordinary citizens who quietly assisted political prisoners, the journalists who continued to believe in truth despite systematic propaganda. These individuals preserved the seeds of democratic possibility through Spain's darkest period. Their courage reminds us that even under the most oppressive circumstances, human dignity can survive if individuals are willing to defend it. Even when institutional protections fail, when legal systems are corrupted, when traditional authorities betray their responsibilities, ordinary people retain the capacity to choose honor over safety, truth over convenience, solidarity over isolation. Ferdinand VII, the felon king, ultimately failed in his attempt to permanently destroy Spanish liberalism. His systematic cruelty succeeded in causing immense human suffering and retarding Spanish development for generations. But he could not eliminate the human capacity for moral courage or the fundamental human desire for dignity and self-governance. That desire, repeatedly suppressed but never fully destroyed, would eventually triumph over the legacy of fear and oppression that Ferdinand created. Not quickly, not easily, not without enormous additional suffering, but ultimately, inevitably, because the human spirit that Ferdinand tried so hard to crush proved more resilient than his instruments of repression. In remembering Ferdinand VII and his victims, we honor not just those who suffered under his rule, but all those throughout history who have faced the choice between submission and resistance, between collaboration and courage, between personal safety and moral integrity. Their struggles remind us that freedom is not a permanent achievement, but an ongoing responsibility, one that each generation must accept anew if civilization is to survive and flourish. The story of Ferdinand VII's Spain is ultimately a story about us, about the choices we make when confronted with injustice, about the prices we are willing to pay for our principles, about the kind of society we create through our individual actions. It is a mirror that reflects not just the darkness of which human beings are capable, but also the light that can never be entirely extinguished as long as someone, somewhere, chooses to keep it burning. In the end, Ferdinand VII's reign reminds us that the greatest perversion is not personal vice or individual cruelty, but the corruption of power itself. the transformation of authority from a tool for human flourishing into an instrument of human degradation. Against this perversion, our strongest defense remains what it has always been: the courage of ordinary people to stand up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost. That courage, displayed by countless unnamed Spanish citizens who refused to surrender their humanity to Ferdinand's reign of terror, remains available to us today. It is our inheritance from those who suffered and died defending the possibility of a better world. Whether we prove worthy of that inheritance depends on the choices we make when our own moment of testing arrives. For it will arrive. History teaches us that much with absolute certainty. The only question is whether we will be ready.